Okay, good morning, everybody. Good morning, and welcome to Sunday morning with the Ramchal. And we are on page 189, and we are in the topic of Nikius, which is a more specific, more refined, a more precise analysis of our actions, of our deeds, in the attempt to try to refine them even further, to try to sift them and elevate them to an even more profound and elevated level. And we're discussing this as it specifically at the moment as it relates to forbidden relations. Okay, so we got onto the topic of what is called in Hebrew arayos, and arayos means illicit sexual relations between human beings that are not condoned by the Torah. So this could be relations with a married woman. This could be relations with a relative. This could be relations with actually anybody that other than your spouse. Okay, and the Ramchal pointed out that in the Torah there's a unique phraseology which we don't often see in the Torah, which is that the Torah says not only are these relationships forbidden, but it's forbidden to even lo sikravu legalos erva. Don't even approach or come close to engaging in illicit relations, which is something that the Torah doesn't really normally do. It's a little bit odd. Like the Torah forbids something. The Torah says, it's forbidden to eat these animals. It's forbidden to eat fish that don't have fins and scales. Okay, but then there's not a verse in the Torah that says v'lo sikravu lechol dagim. There's no verse that says don't even come close to or approach or stay far away from eating these forbidden foods. The Torah doesn't do that. And yet for some reason when it comes to forbidden relations, illicit relations, the Torah makes a statement of lo sikravu legalos erva. Don't even approach the border of something which could be considered illicit relations. I remember, there's an interesting halacha. We discussed this in the past that prohibits what's called yichud. Yichud means being alone, isolated in a closed quarters with somebody of the opposite gender who's not a relative or not a spouse or whatever. And so for example, if someone, let's say you have a workman coming into the house to do some work on the furnace, and you're not home and your wife is home alone, whatever. So there are questions, there are halachic parameters about what's okay, what's not okay. How do you handle such a situation when you have to be alone? And obviously, in situations like medical situations, there are obviously moments where you're going to have to be alone with a patient. There are all kinds of situations that come up, and they're complicated. And the there's a lot of halacha. There's a lot of details that explain what's okay, what's not okay. Maybe you leave the door open a little bit, whatever it is. So our the rabbi that we were being trained by before we went out into our rabbinical careers, he once said, I don't want you to ask me any questions at all regarding yichud. Like, I don't want you to come to me with any questions regarding whether this is okay or not okay, and permissible, not permissible, which is a weird thing to say, because normally, he would say, if you guys have any questions regarding anything rabbinically, whether something's permitted or not permitted, so come to me and ask me the questions. But when it comes to this, he said, don't ask questions. So I didn't understand what he meant. So I asked him, and he said, put it like this. He said, if you have a question at all about whether this is permissible or not permissible, if there's any level of doubt at all, then assume it's not permissible, then stay away from it. We don't say that in other areas of halacha. We don't create that automatic fence or boundary around everything else in our Jewish life. But when it comes to the area of illicit relations, we have we tend to lean towards the extreme strict side, stringencies. We place stringencies after stringencies, and that's because of the reality of human nature and the awareness that these types of situations can have a strong appeal to the Yetzer Hara, and also can really be the moral downfall of a human being, as we all know from watching the news and following what goes on in the world. So that's where we're up to. He made an interesting comparison between the prohibition of coming close to a woman who's not your wife and the Nazirite. The Nazirite, we know the Nazir in the Torah, the Nazir is somebody who takes a vow upon himself not to drink any wine, among other things. But one of the things he's not allowed to do is, one of the things he vows not to do is to drink wine. So if a person vows to become a Nazir, a Nazirite, so he's not allowed to drink wine because he just took a vow not to do so. But in addition to that, he's also prohibited from consuming grapes or raisins or anything which is a derivative of the grape that could either be used to create wine or could lead him to drink wine. And that's another example in the Torah where when you're prohibited from doing something, the Torah adds levels of stringency and fences and safeguards to keep you far away from that potential concern. So there's a comparison between these two mitzvahs: the mitzvah of not being isolated with anybody who's not your wife, and the mitzvah of being a Nazirite. And that's where we are on the bottom on 189. So the Ramchal elaborates on this comparison to the Nazirite. Observe how remarkable the message of this midrashic discourse is, in that it compares the prohibition of arayos again being illicit sexual relations with somebody who's not your wife, to that of the Nazir, the Nazirite, who's prohibited from drinking wine and, as a result, grapes and grape products, which is unique in that although the primary prohibition upon a Nazir is only against drinking wine, when he vowed to become a Nazirite, what he was vowing to do is to stay away from wine. Nevertheless, the Torah also explicitly forbade him to consume anything related to wine. This was a lesson that the Torah taught the sages regarding how they should also create protective fences around the laws of the Torah. And I want to discuss this in a minute. Let's just finish the sentence. Through the safeguards that they were empowered to create for the protection of the Torah's laws, for the sages are to learn from the case of the Nazir to prohibit for the sake of safeguarding the primary prohibition anything that resembles it. Okay, so let me explain what this means. Basically, in Jewish law, we have something called Isurei Deoraisa, which are Torah prohibitions, and we have Isurei Dirabanan, which are rabbinical prohibitions. Now, a Torah prohibition might be, for example, don't light a fire on Shabbos, or I'll give you another example. Don't write on Shabbos. Writing on Shabbos is a Torah prohibition. The Torah prohibits writing on Shabbos. Okay. So now the rabbis are told that one of their jobs, one of their responsibilities is to make sure that the Jewish people stay far, far, far away from any possibility of violating a Torah prohibition. And therefore, they are told to legislate additional rabbinical fences to make sure that we as Jews don't violate the Torah prohibitions. So therefore, the rabbis come along with a concept which is called muktzah, which means on Shabbos, there are items that we're not even allowed to touch rabbinically. These are rabbinical prohibitions. So one of the things that you're not allowed to touch is a pen. Can't touch a pen on Shabbos. If there's a pen on the table and you want to use it to, clean the wax out of your ears, which is gross, by the way, you're not allowed to do that on Shabbos, not only because it's gross, but because the rabbi said there are items which can lead you. If I'm allowed to touch a pen, then I might end up writing. So picking up the pen is rabbinically prohibited. Using the pen to write is prohibited on the Torah level. So this is one of the jobs that the rabbis were given. When I say rabbis, I don't mean, me and, rabbi at the local synagogue. I mean the Sanhedrin, the rabbinical body that was empowered to create rabbinical laws. That's one of the jobs that they have, to create safeguards around the Torah prohibitions to keep us far, far away from stumbling in those areas. So, and the example of the Nazirite, which the Torah itself does an unusual thing and creates fences for the Nazirite, is there to teach the rabbis that they are also supposed to act just like God did to create fences around the prohibition. The rabbis are also supposed to create their own fences around the prohibition. So there are many, many things that we do as Jews which are prohibited only rabbinically. They're not prohibited by the Torah law, but they're prohibited by rabbinical law. Okay, but it's important to know. It's important to know when something is prohibited by Torah law and when something is prohibited by rabbinical law. Why do you think it's important to know that? Why does it matter to me? If it's prohibited, it's prohibited. We don't do it, right? Eating milk and meat from a cow together is prohibited by Torah law. Eating milk and chicken together is, as far as the Torah is concerned, totally permissible, but it's prohibited rabbinically. Okay, not allowed to do it. So the bottom line is, it's prohibited rabbinically or from the Torah. What difference does it make, right? Why does it matter to me? Why do I have to know? Why is it important for me to know if a law is prohibited min ha-Torah, from the Torah, or midrabanan, from the rabbis? Anyone want to take a stab at that one?
It's possible if there's a conflict between the mitzvot that you need to know which has a higher.
Okay, excellent. That is correct. That's one very valid answer, which is, you could have a situation where I might be commanded to do something by the Torah, and or let's say, I can't think of a situation off the top of my head, but let's say there are two prohibitions and I'm in a really bad situation and I'm going to have to violate one of them. Like, I don't know what the scenario might be, but then it would be important to know which is the Torah prohibition and which is the rabbinical prohibition, because obviously if I'm going to violate one of them, I'm going to violate the rabbinical prohibition. Okay.
What about like the situation where there's something critical or for the health or life? Let's say I don't know how this would happen. You're trapped on an island and all you have is chicken and milk, and there's not enough for either one to survive, or you have to combine the two to survive, and you would just do that and that's just a rabbinical law.
Right. Exactly. So that's that's the other reason why it's important to know what's rabbinical and what's not, because there are situations. Now, obviously, to save a life, you're allowed to violate any law, even a Torah law, right? Except for the three major prohibitions, which are illicit relations, right? And idol worship and murder. Those are the three things that I can't ever violate, even if it means giving up my life. But if it's anything else, if it's kashrus, if you're, the stories that we all know about from people that were in the camps in Auschwitz and other, death camps where they were given a small, tiny ration of food and it was not kosher. And if they didn't eat it, they were going to die. They were probably going to die anyway, but at least they had a possibility of staying alive. So of course, there's no question whatsoever. You eat whatever you need to eat to stay alive. But if there's a situation, let's say, where, I'll give you an example. I'll give you a perfect example. So Allie is, because she has one kidney, her doctor feels that it's not a great thing for her to fast, right? So he doesn't say it's like the worst thing in the world and you absolutely should never, ever, ever do it, but you shouldn't do it really. It's not good for her to fast if she doesn't have to. So therefore, what does Allie do? On the fasts, the one fast that is min haTorah, the only Torah mandated fast is Yom Kippur. So she fasts on Yom Kippur, right? But the other fasts, the fast of Esther or the fast of Teves, the fast of Tammuz, all these other fasts, she does not fast, right? So knowing when it's a Torah prohibition or a rabbinical prohibition is very important, okay? So the rabbis are empowered, and not only empowered, but mandated to require to create these rabbinical fences around the laws so that we don't violate them. And that comes from the Nazarite. And that, yeah, Michael.
So is it a sin to break rabbinical law, or does that just lead you to potentially committing a sin? Is that the rabbinical laws,
So it's a very interesting question, because there's a verse in the Torah which says lo sasur min hadavar asher yagidu lahem yaminu small, which means do not veer from that which the rabbis mandate left or right. Meaning the Torah mandates, the Torah empowers the rabbis to create rabbinical law and binds us to follow the rabbinical law, right? So it could be considered a violation of that Torah law, the one that says we're supposed to listen to what the rabbis say. But again, when there's a conflict, it's certainly better to violate the rabbinical law than the Torah law. Okay, so now let's pick up back where we were in the middle of 190. It thus emerges that the Torah itself did, regarding the mitzvah of Nazar, the Nazarite, what it delegated to the sages to do regarding all the other mitzvahs. Meaning the Torah tells the rabbis in all cases, make rabbinical fences. And in one case, the Torah itself, God himself, so to speak, made a fence in the case of the Nazarite. And that was to be an example for the rabbis to learn from the Torah how they're supposed to do that and what they're supposed to do. In order for us to know that this creation of safeguards for the mitzvos is the will of the omnipresent, meaning it's Hashem's will. If Hashem never did that in the Torah, we wouldn't know. How would you know? Maybe we're not supposed to make rabbinical laws and safeguards. Maybe we don't want to add, and generally, by the way, we don't want to make life harder than it already is. We don't add stringencies out of nowhere for no reason whatsoever. So maybe the rabbis, are wrong for adding rabbinical fences and protections. But the case of the Nazarite, where the Torah itself creates a protection, the Nazarite vows not to drink wine, and the Torah says, okay, don't drink wine and don't drink grapes, don't eat grapes or raisins either. It's what gave the rabbis the clarity that they were supposed to create protective fences for the Torah prohibitions, so that when he forbids any one of the other prohibitions in the Torah and does not specify that related acts are also prohibited, The unspecified should be derived from the specified, so that the sages should proceed to prohibit anything closely related to the explicitly prohibited act. Okay. So in keeping with this approach, the sages prohibited in this realm of illicit relations anything that is related to licentiousness or anything close to it, regardless of which bodily sense is involved. That is, whether it involves action or sight or speech or hearing, or even if it involves only thought, as we shall see. Okay, so what we're basically arriving at right now is the Torah lists a number of relationships that are prohibited, sexual relationships that are prohibited, and the rabbis, following the example of the Nazarite, came along and added a whole bunch of additional stringencies, rabbinically mandated stringencies, to make sure that we don't come anywhere near the possibility of violating the Torah prohibition. Okay, and those additional stringencies, they involve what we see and what we do and what we say, what we hear, and even what we think, as we'll see in a minute. Okay, so having established that all the senses must be free of moral impropriety, Ramchal elaborates regarding each one, beginning with physical contact. So I will now cite for you proofs regarding all these secondary forms of erva. Erva is like arayos, illicit relations, from the words of the sages of blessed memory. Okay, so here we go. Here are the rabbinical fences keeping us far away from the Torah prohibition. With regard to action, that is touching, hugging, and the like, their inappropriateness was already clarified in the Midrashic discourse that we mentioned above, and there's no need to elaborate. Okay, he mentioned above that the Torah prohibition itself might be the actual sexual act, but the rabbis came along and prohibited any physical contact between a man and a woman who is not his wife, let's say, that could potentially lead to sexual contact. Okay, so hugging and kissing and and shaking hands, all these things. This is why we don't men and women don't shake hands or hug or whatever, unless it's your mother, grandmother, daughter, sister, whatever. But unrelated men and women do not hug each other or even shaking hands. Now that, I think we spoke about this a couple of weeks ago, but that sometimes creates very awkward situations. And sometimes, you don't have much choice but to shake somebody's hand. But it's definitely something that we try to avoid if possible. Okay, now what about sight? So with regard to looking at inappropriate matters, the sages of blessed memory said, from hand to hand, he will not be spared evil from evil. It teaches us that anyone who counts out money from his hand into a woman's hand in order to gaze at her will not be exonerated from the judgment of Gehenna. Okay, he's not touching her. There's no physical contact in that situation, but it's all an opportunity for him to gaze upon her and to look at her and to admire her beauty or whatever. So that is something that is prohibited, that rabbinically, obviously, and that we have to try to avoid. They also said, why did the Jews of that generation, talking about the war against the Midianites when the Jewish people entered the land of Israel, why did the Jews of that generation, i.e. the commanders who led the war against the Midianites in the wilderness, need atonement? Because their eyes feasted on the lewdness during their conquest of Midian. the Gemara there continues that Rav Shesha said, why did the Torah, in describing the atonement gift that the soldiers brought, list the outer jewelry along with the intimate jewelry, to teach you that whoever gazes at the little finger of a woman is like one who gazes at the most private place. Okay, again, it depends on why you're doing it, but if you're gazing upon her to be able to enjoy her beauty, or to or it's accompanied with specific thoughts, then it's something that that we are meant to try to avoid at all costs. And they said further, you shall be aware of any evil thing, i.e., any evil thought, which teaches that a man may not gaze at a beautiful woman, even if she is unmarried, or at a married woman, even if she is unattractive. Okay, meaning he's not deriving any direct benefit from her. He's not feeling attracted to her. We still have to avoid that type of contact. Now, what about hearing? With regarding to speaking with women, we've already learned the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, anyone who converses excessively with a woman causes evil to himself. And with regard to hearing, the sages said the singing of a voice of a woman is considered erva. Now, it's interesting, I just want to point out over here that all these prohibitions are put on the men, right? They're all incumbent on the man. It's not talking about prohibiting a woman from gazing at a man, or from listening to a man sing, or from over excessively speaking to a man. And I think the reason for that, it's pretty obvious, I would say, that men are much more visually stimulated than women. And the proof of that, of course, is that when you're selling anything, whether it's a car or a pack of cigarettes or a beer or whatever it is, if you're selling it to men, all you have to do is put a scantily clad, beautiful woman model in the advertisement, and your chances of selling that product go way up. But if you're selling it to women, it doesn't work the other way. You don't put some guy model in the ad to try to sell to women. That's not how you sell to women, because they don't see that ad and think like, wow, if I buy that beer, I'm going to have that guy. Okay, because they don't have the same sort of visual stimulus that men do. But if a man sees that same advertisement with a beautiful woman in the advertisement, he's going to be, and he's stimulated by it, he's going to go out and buy that beer. Okay, or at least perhaps, that's the idea. So it has to do with the psychology, the way that we think and the way women think. Yeah, Michael, I think both Michaels have questions, comments.
Michael Glickman, you want to go first?
Yeah, I was just wanted the definition of anyone who converses excessively with a woman. That seems pretty restrictive.
Right. So what does it mean excessively? It's a good question, and I think it has to be, taken in context and it's relative. But if it's the type of conversation that's leading somewhere that could potentially become inappropriate, then that's a good indication that you've crossed over the line. Yeah.
So, Rabbi, you mentioned that the prohibition is on the man and not on the woman for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
Is there any sort of requirement for a woman to be dressed modestly, or to be modest, or to not tempt a man in that, or is it all on the man?
Well, yeah. So I definitely think that that's part of the reason why we have these pretty strict modesty laws in Judaism, is because of the realization that the way men think and the way men work and the way they are visually stimulated is a reality that we don't, it's just a reality that Judaism is real with. So certainly, there's a concept in Judaism of don't put a stumbling block in front of the blind, right? Which is don't cause somebody else to transgress a prohibition that that's incumbent upon them. Like, if a person, if it's a question like, let's say, working at a non-kosher restaurant and serving Jewish people because you're serving them non-kosher food, you're not eating the food, but you're giving it to them and they're going to eat it. So you're putting a stumbling block in front of the blind. So obviously, if a woman is dressed in a provocative way, so in a sense, she's putting a stumbling block in front of the man. And, that's not a very politically correct thing to say these days, but that's never stopped me from saying what needs to be said. And it never will stop me from saying what needs to be said. So it's important to remember that, that doesn't mean, you can, that certainly doesn't justify inappropriate behavior. And you can't claim that, well, she dressed that way, so it's her fault. That's obviously completely wrong and false. But there's a mutual responsibility. Men have a responsibility to try to guard their eyes and protect what they're looking at and what they're gazing at, and women have a responsibility to try to not be provocative and to not put men in a situation where they're going to act in the way that they're not supposed to act either. So it has to work together. It has to work together in a healthy way, in a healthy community and society. It works that way, and but it can go too far. It does go too far. It can be taken to a ridiculous extreme, where modesty, becomes sort of like a religion unto its own, and it goes way, way, way too far. But a basic level of modesty, I think, is definitely a bedrock of a healthy moral society. And by the way, the modesty isn't just women; it's men too. And there are things that go into modesty that are more than just dress. Modesty has to do with behavior. Modesty has to do with drawing attention to yourself in any way. When you walk into the room, are you the kind of person who, like, you walk into the room and everyone has to know that you've walked into the room, and you draw all eyes onto you somehow, whether because of what you're wearing or the way you walk in or what you're saying. So we have to be careful in general with modesty, and recognize that that's a real value in Judaism. Okay, any other comments on that? Okay. And what about speech and hearing? So furthermore, concerning immorality of the mouth and ears, that is, talking about lewd matters or listening to such talk. Okay, the sages have already cried out like a crane and declared that the prohibition of such indiscretions is alluded to in the Torah itself. For when the verse says, ervas davar, which means literally matters of immorality, davar also means speech. So shall not be among you. The phrase ervas davar should be understood to mean ervas dibur, erva in speech, meaning immorality in speech, speaking in a way that which refers to lewd speech. And regarding this prohibition, the sages said, fear of sin, for the sin of speaking lewdly, new troubles arise, and young men of the enemies of Israel, which is a euphemism for the Jews themselves, die. It's a very severe sin. They said further, anyone who speaks lewdly, the chasm of Gehenna is deepened for him. Okay. And they continued and said, everyone knows why a bride enters the chuppah, but anyone who perverts his mouth and actually says it, then even if the heavenly court has sealed from a favorable decree of 70 years, he will reverse it for him and replace him with a decree of evil. They also said elsewhere, even casual conversations between a man and his wife is recounted to a person at the time of his judgment. And with respect to listening to the evil kind of speech, they similarly said, even one who merely listens to lewd conversations and remains silent, failing to protest, has Gehenna deepened for him. As it is stated, the scorned of Hashem will fall there. From all this, you should have clear proof that all the senses must be free of immorality and anything related to it. Okay, it's pretty intense, right? But you see that Judaism takes this concept of immorality to a very, very, takes it very, very seriously, and it's really sort of the essence of what creates a moral society. It's something that is so foreign today to our culture, between the internet and social media, and it's all about the culture that we live in today is all about flaunting, and it's all about being as provocative as you possibly can. And I saw a funny meme recently. It was a picture of women on a beach in the 50s in their bathing suits, with the little skirts and the way those bathing suits used to look like in the 50s. And the meme basically said, bathing suits of the 50s have become the prom dresses of our generation, and it's literally it's exactly the same thing. So we live with that challenge. We live in a very a society and a culture in a time that has really lost the sensitivity to this type of morality, and it's a challenge. It's hard to live and navigate in such a world when you're trying to live with a certain level of purity, and the world around you doesn't live that way, and the way people speak and what they speak about and what they look at and what they think about, and it brings down the whole moral fabric, the whole moral basis of a society is compromised, and it's really it's definitely one of the big challenges of living a religious life and living a moral life in the 21st century. All right, let's go a little bit further here. Ramchal addresses a misconception about the prohibition against lewd speech. If someone should whisper to you saying that what the sages said about lewd speech is meant only to frighten and distance a person from the severe transgressions of an actual act of immorality, and according to the ominous words cited above, they were said specifically about a hot-blooded person whose desire becomes aroused when speaking about such matters, and who might be led by them to actually commit a major sin. But when a person makes a lewd remark only in jest, it is of no moral significance, and there's no reason to be concerned about it. If someone makes this claim, you should answer him, these have been the arguments of the Yetzer Hara, of the evil inclination, because his claim is refuted by the explicit verse that the sages of blessed memory cited as their proof that the sin of lewd speech causes new troubles to arise and young men to die. Therefore, my Lord shall not rejoice over their young men, and he shall not pity their orphans and widows, for they are all flattery and evil, and every mouth utters indecency. So in explaining Hashem's displeasure with Israel, with the Jewish people, this verse did not mention any of the cardinal sins, neither the sin of idolatry or illicit relations or murder. Rather, it is mentioned only the sin of flattery, of wicked people, and evil speech and lewd speech. Note that all of these are among the sins of the mouth committed through mere speech, and yet, on their account alone, the fearful decree was promulgated. My Lord shall not rejoice over their young men, and he shall not pity their orphans and widows. Rather, the undeniable truth is, as taught by the words of the sages of blessed memory, that lewd speech is actually erva of the mouth and is forbidden because it is an inherent form of immorality, meaning this is not all just a big scare tactic by the rabbis to try to keep you far, 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 far away from immorality. But really, the truth is, between you and me, indecent speech is not immorality. No, indecent speech is a form of immorality. It's not just offense to keep you away from what's inappropriate. It is in and of itself inappropriate. Like all other matters of morality, aside from the act of immoral cohabitation itself, although these matters are not punishable by kares, premature death, or by a court-imposed death penalty, they are nevertheless forbidden matters in their own right, aside from the fact that they instigate and lead to the primary forbidden act itself. This is in line with the precedent set by the laws of the Nazarite, the Nazir, which the sages mentioned in the Midrash that was cited above. Okay, so what the Ramchal is telling us over here is that, and I guess the way that I think we should relate to it or can relate to it is that it's something to be aware of. I mean, give a shout out to my friend Scott Penner over here. He was we were on the on our last men's trip, and Mike Blickman also has been on one of the men's trips. You guys can attest to the fact that one of the challenges for the rabbis on these trips, me and Rabbi Gadi and whoever else is going on these trips, is the types of conversations that take place between the guys are not always, let's say, do not always meet the Ramchal's threshold of appropriate speech. Okay. And it's sometimes it's a little bit of a challenge between, on one hand, as the rabbi, you want to be part of the guys and you want to be with the guys and you want to have fun and you want them to feel comfortable and you want them to feel like they can be themselves around you. But at the same time, it can get pretty inappropriate. And I find this with the younger generation. I do not find it with the older generation. And I don't know if that's because, when the older generation was younger, they were like that too, or if that's just a sign of the reality of the generation. But somehow when I look at my friend Jeff Wenner up there in the corner, and I think about, what a true mensch of the generation above me looks like. I can't imagine that when Jeff was in his 20s or 30s, that he was sitting around and talking to his buddies the way that 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds are talking to their buddies today. I don't believe it was the same. I think that there's been a moral decline, and I think that it's to the point where it's like even talking about these things to people is like, what planet are you on, Rabbi? Like, where are you coming from? Like, get with the times. This is like, the train has left the station, and it's hard, that's why I don't usually talk about it, but it is definitely a basis, a foundation of living a moral life. Is it begins with what you look at and what you don't look at, and what you talk about and what you don't talk about, what you listen to, what you don't listen to. And, it's something to think about. And it's definitely something to, that doesn't mean that the next time you get together with your friends and they start talking about what guys usually end up talking about, that you should get on your, high horse and start preaching to them about the Ramchal and, and Gehenna and the chasms and all these things. I don't think that's going to help, but, but you yourself can be an example of the way you speak, types of, language that you use and stuff. And people will, I think, respect that, and people will look up to that, and they'll notice something different. Even if they can't quite put their finger on it, they'll notice something different about you, the way you carry yourself with just a little higher level of morality, the way you speak, and, the types of things that you look at and don't look at. And okay.
Well, David, really quick, I'll be really quick. As a compliment to you, I think that by your own nature, you make people so comfortable sometimes they forget you're a rabbi. And that's what I noticed in our group. And I actually corrected a lot of people, like, not rabbi talk. You know, there a lot of people cross the line when they're with you because you make people very comfortable.
Well, I appreciate that, and I think there's truth to that, and I think you're exactly like, yeah, I think that, you know, sometimes it's hard for me to find the right exact balance between, you know, making people feel comfortable and also sort of setting an example, you know. So sometimes I do a better job than others, you know. Depends who I'm with, depends who's around. There are certain people that whatever. Okay. Anyway, fine. Let's finish. But let's finish over here to up to this this topic, and then we can pause there. So having discussed improper speech, Ramchal turns to the prohibition against improper thoughts. Now this is taking it to an even more refined level. Remember, we're sifting over here, sifting. So I'm not going to engage in any sexually immoral act. Okay. Now I'm trying not to engage in any immoral conversations, and trying to not look at things that are inappropriate, you know. And if you want to succeed in that, you're going to have to remove every app from your phone and your browser and everything else, because otherwise, good luck. But now I'm trying to take it to an even more elevated level. I'm trying to refine it even more, where I'm actually controlling what I'm even thinking about. And that, of course, is the hardest of all. Thoughts, lewd thoughts, concerning lewd thoughts. The sages already stated at the beginning of our brisa, Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, which we quoted a long time ago, when the Torah says, you shall guard against anything evil, it means that a person should not think lewd thoughts by day, and thereby come to ritual impurity, seminal emission at night. They also said sinful thoughts, i.e. lewd thoughts, are more severe than the sin itself, which is a complicated idea. And this idea is expressed by an explicit verse: the abomination of Hashem are thoughts of evil. Okay, Ramchal summarizes the content of this chapter to this point. Now we have discussed Nikius in regards to two severe transgressions, whose offshoots people are likely to stumble in, because of the abundance of such offshoots, and because of the strong inclination of a person's heart toward them due to his desire for them. And they remember what they were. The first one was theft, stealing things, taking things that don't belong to us, because it's very easy to do that, and there's a very strong inclination to do that, and it can be so subtle, and it may not even feel like stealing, and it might be something that everybody else around us does. That was one. And two was the realm of sexual immorality, and where the expectations are not only that we not get involved in physical acts of immorality, but even refine our thoughts, our words, our actions to such a level. Okay, so I don't want to start the third section of forbidden foods now, because that's a whole new section, which is a good place to start next week. But we have a few minutes. So if anybody has any questions or thoughts or comments, feel free to jump in.
Rabbi,
Yeah,
can I ask a question about last week's class?
yeah,
Or is
sure.
that too off topic?
No,
So one of the things I was thinking about this week, you had mentioned that, you know, King David prophesied about Esther as it, as the doe in the morning, and that this was kind of an inflection point in human history and a turning point in our thought process of realizing that miracles were not just the big splitting of the sea and the big out of nature things, but there was an everyday, every second of every day with every period kind of miracle always going on. And at the time of Purim, that was kind of the realization point in human history for that.
Mhm.
And so I don't know if it's just a different school of thought or what it is, but I think we've talked about before how every generation from Mount Sinai on would be diminished in their holiness and somehow, right? And so how is it possible that this generation of Purim realized something that the prophets and the sages and the people in the past didn't? It feels like we were evolving instead of devolving, or how does that work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think both trends are true. I think that, as we get further and further away from our Sinai, and the revelation of Torah becomes dimmer, it becomes harder for us to connect to that revelation. And, we've lost prophecy, and we've lost a step below prophecy is Ruach HaKodesh, which is another form of sort of clairvoyance, where people have an awareness into the spiritual realm. And that's all true. But at the same time, Rav Kook writes about the fact that the world is constantly progressing, and that there's a tshuva that's always taking place, not just as individuals, but the whole world is moving towards a place of an ultimate redemption, and ultimate clarity, and ultimate revelation at the same time. So somehow those two things are happening simultaneously. I don't really know how to put those together, other than the fact that maybe, on an individual level, as individuals, as people, we become less and less, spiritual, or less and less, God have less God awareness. But at the same time, we're climbing on the shoulders of the people that came before us. So, like, ultimately, when Mashiach comes, it's not going to be because of us in this generation. We're like, if Mashiach didn't come in the generation of the Vilna Gaon, or the generation of the Chafetz Chaim, how's it going to come in our generation? But the answer is because everything that we do, the little tiny things that we contribute, are building upon what all the generations that came before us have been building on, have been contributing to. So I don't know. It requires some thought, to think about how these things fit together. But it's clear that those initial revelations, the open miracles, and all of that stuff is no longer part of our reality. But it's also true that we have, achieved spiritual things that haven't been achieved in previous generations. So I'm not really answering your question. I'm just kind of thinking it, out
That's
loud.
okay.
Yeah, thinking it through out loud with you a little bit. But yeah, I don't know. What do you think about it? What you must have had?
I tried to think of, thought of just, I kept getting myself turned around and around in circles. It's hard to believe that I, or someone of my generation, can realize, that God is involved in every single aspect of my life. But Joshua didn't realize that, or David didn't realize that, or something like that. That seems counterintuitive.
Right. So maybe, right. I mean, I don't know if that's a fair comparison, because you're talking about the individual great.
Sure.
Well, not that you're not one of the individual great people, but
Yeah.
but I think you'd have to compare the masses to the masses, maybe. And that's a hard thing to even know. Like, I mean, think about it, like, the masses were serving idols, idolatry, which, has really very little appeal to any of us, today. So on some level, they were tempted by things that we're not tempted by. So I don't know. Interesting.
Okay.
Maybe again, maybe it's that there were visible signs of Hashem that you saw. They saw visible signs of Hashem. That was the whole point. So they didn't really need to know. They didn't have to take it on faith that he's involved in their life, because there were visible signs of it, right? And then what happened is, okay, then maybe there's less visible signs, but at least word of mouth, you knew somebody who knew that, who saw something. So, so then generations passed, there weren't any visible signs. And then finally people started to realize that but in the Purim story, they realized that he had been there all along, and it just had this, that the eyewitness reports had been so diluted at that point that was where their faith was. that they had to realize it themselves.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting way of thinking about it, I think. Yeah. All right. All right, very good. Great to see everybody. Shavua Tov. Have a great week.
Thank you.